Good evening, Rowan. It's the 28th of January 2016 and it's just after midnight, and I'm making you another video to talk a bit more about your attitude towards sexuality and sexual behaviour and sexual morality. I'm not actually going to be talking this evening anymore about the lecture that you gave at the Royal College of Medicine. But on the same subject, I'm going to talk a little bit about a lecture that you gave to the lesbian and gay Christian movement in 1989, entitled The Body's Grace. And the reason I'm doing this is because you were going round behind my back, as you know, which I've said many times before, lying your face off about my sexual behaviour or alleged sexual behaviour, and really implying that I was a prostitute and a repressed lesbian and all sorts of other things and a danger to the public and this kind of thing, and inciting people to treat me in a vile way and trying to entrap me with all kinds of mentally disturbed half-wits. So this was an obsession of yours that lasted over a decade and would be still going on now if you could get away with it. So I just want to talk a little bit about your attitude towards sexuality and sexual morality, so we can understand the context of your behaviour a bit better. So this talk to the lesbian and gay Christian movement. Before I go on actually to talk about that, this talk was given in 1989. You were appointed as Bishop of Monmouth in 1991, so that was 2 years after this lecture. You were appointed Bishop of Monmouth, and in case anyone thinks you changed your mind between 1989 and the time when you were appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, which was 2002, this lecture was actually published again in 2002, and I can demonstrate that here because I've got it here on Amazon. Look, there you are, 1st of September 2002. And your appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury was announced in July 2002. So you're setting out your agenda really, aren't you, by having this lecture republished or allowing it to be republished only some months after your appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury had been announced. Now, a long time before I even read this lecture, which is available online, I'll put a link in the show notes, a long time before I read it, I heard that you'd given this absolutely brilliant lecture about same-sex relationships, about sexuality and sexual behaviour, and this was an absolutely amazing, mind-blowing lecture, demonstrating kind of insight that had never been heard of before and this kind of thing. So when I came to read this lecture, I was expecting something absolutely mind-blowing because it was so celebrated that you'd given this amazing lecture, and oh, Rowan Williams, isn't he amazing? And among all the reasons why he's amazing, he gave this amazing lecture called The Body's Grace, in which he thought about sexuality in a way that no one had before, or something like that. This was the impression I got anyway. So I was really expecting something absolutely mind-blowing when I came to read it. But unfortunately, it's just your usual total crap. It's complete and utter crap. Well, the first thing to say about it is that you're supposed to be okay, so you want to promote the idea that the church should accept same-sex relationships. So you're giving this lecture. Well, I kind of expected you might have been looking at biblical texts or something like that in order to argue your point. Silly me. But instead, it's like a kind of essay in English literature. You're looking at various books and characters in novels and creating an exegesis of this as if it had the same authority as the Bible or something. Now, this is a perfectly legitimate enterprise if you're studying English literature or teaching English literature, but to kind of derive a moral framework from works of fiction when you're supposed to be a Christian, I mean, it's a bit bizarre, really, to be frank. And I am going to play a clip at the end of this video, actually, where you say how fiction is really important to your life of faith. Which I think I'd figured that out a long time ago anyway, but it's nice to hear it coming out of your mouth. So anyway, I'm just going to make some brief quotations from this lecture that you gave to the lesbian and gay Christian movement in 1989, which was published in 2002, a couple of months after your appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury was announced. And I just want to talk about your attitude towards sex, sexual behaviour, sexual morality, really to put your behaviour towards me in a kind of framework. So here's a couple of things that you say. Most people know that sexual intimacy is in some ways frightening for them. Most know that it is quite simply the place where they begin to be taught whatever maturity they have. Most of us know that the whole business is irredeemably comic, surrounded by so many odd chances and so many opportunities for making a fool of yourself. Well, I just think this is completely and utterly bizarre. You are such a strange man, you're really strange. Sexual intimacy is in some ways frightening. Well, in what context would it be frightening, really, when you're having it forced on you? Sexual intimacy isn't frightening. It's not frightening. So, you're saying that you find it frightening. Do you always find it frightening? I mean, even with your wife, is it frightening? Is that what you're talking about? It doesn't seem to me like in this passage that you're writing, you being so concerned about sexual morality, obviously, which is why you had me hounded around the country for decades. You're not talking about sex with your wife, are you? Saying that sexual intimacy is in some ways frightening for them. Most know that it is quite simply the place where they begin to be taught whatever maturity they have. Well, let's look at that statement. Sexual intimacy is quite simply the place where they begin to be taught whatever maturity they have. Well, when did you get married then? It was in the late 70s, wasn't it? Or maybe early 80s. But you were born in 1950, so if you got married, let's say 1978, I think it was even later than that, in the early 80s. But let's assume it was in the late 70s, so you were already nearly 30 when you got married, and quite possibly over 30, and what you're saying is that sexual intimacy is quite simply the place where they begin to be taught whatever maturity they have. So you didn't have any maturity then, because obviously you wouldn't have been having any sexual intimacy before you were married, would you? Being such a stalwart and defender of sexual morality, and to such an extent that you have to have someone hounded around the country and treated in a vile way. So you didn't learn any maturity until you were in your late 20s or early 30s, is that what you're saying? What you're saying is that someone forced it on you when you were a child, that's what you're saying. Most of us know that the whole business is irredeemably comic, surrounded by so many odd chances and so many opportunities for making a fool of yourself. Well, I think you're speaking for yourself again here, because I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And I've never heard anyone else say anything like this either. The whole business is irredeemably comic, surrounded by so many odd chances and so many opportunities for making a fool of yourself. You're not talking about your wife, are you? That's quite surprising, isn't it, since you such a defender of sexual morality, and I'm such a danger to the public in this respect. So it's quite surprising, really, that you would be saying things that imply that you've been having sex with people to whom you weren't married. That's quite a surprise, really, isn't it, since you care about sexual morality so much. Anyway, you go on to talk about some novels, and you make quotations from other people. So you're talking about a character in a novel called Sarah Layton, and you say this: when the manipulative and cynical but sharp-eyed Clark at last coaxes her into bed, as they enact a tenderness that is not really that of lovers, Sarah comes to herself. Hours later, on the train journey back to her family, she looks in the mirror and sees that she has entered her body's grace. What does this mean? I'm abbreviating this slightly. What does this mean? It is starkly clear that there is no lasting joy for Sarah. There is a pregnancy and an abortion, a continuing loneliness. And then a bit later on you say, but it is still grace, a filling of the void, an entry into some different kind of identity. There may be little love, even little generosity, in Clark's bedding of Sarah, but Sarah has discovered that her body can be the cause of happiness to her and to another. Grace, for the Christian believer, is a transformation that depends in large part on knowing yourself to be seen in a certain way, as significant and wanted. Well, Sarah wasn't significant and wanted, was she? She was exploited, because if she'd been significant and wanted, then this person, Clark, who coaxed her into bed, wouldn't have just abandoned her pregnant, which led her to having an abortion, would he? He would have stayed with her. So she wasn't significant and wanted. He used her and then threw her away. So that's quite a bizarre interpretation of the way that you describe this event. I haven't read this book, so I don't know if you're presenting it in an accurate fashion. And so you think that getting pregnant and having an abortion from a one-night stand that you didn't even want, that's grace. That's a bit strange, really. It's quite vile, in fact. Really vile. Do you know, if that had been me, I wouldn't have been sitting on the train on the way home thinking I'd entered into my body's grace. I'd be battering Clark over the head with a blunt instrument. But he'd have never done that to me anyway. I wasn't born yesterday, and I'm not that easily manipulated, as you've found out to your cost. Anyway, you go on later on to talk about blessings of sexual relationships. I think you're talking about same-sex relationships, but anyway, you're talking about blessings of sexual relationships, and then you say, it is both wicked and useless to hold up the sexuality of the canonically married heterosexual as the absolute exclusive ideal. So you not only think that same-sex relationships should be blessed, you think it's wicked and useless to regard married heterosexual sex as the absolute and exclusive ideal. You think that's wicked and useless. That's really quite strange, isn't it? Considering how terrible a thing it was that I might be a lesbian. You're a really weird man, you are so weird. What a creep, honestly. Anyway, you go on to say, yet the realities of our experience in looking for such possibilities suggest pretty clearly that an absolute declaration that every sexual partnership must conform to the pattern of commitment or else have the nature of sin and nothing else is unreal and silly. So you're not even talking about marriage here, so even if you're saying you shouldn't have a one night stand, you should only have sex in a relationship, even if you're not talking about marriage, even that is unreal and silly. You're just unbelievable. You're absolutely unbelievable that you spout so much crap. I mean, I know you're talking about this before the event that you were going around slandering me behind my back, but I actually wasn't the only young woman you were going around telling people was a lesbian. I know that for a fact, Rowan. I wasn't the only one. So, it's quite strange, isn't it, really, that even if I had been a repressed lesbian and trying to seduce priests anyway, you shouldn't have been really concerned about that, because you think it's wicked and useless to hold up the sexuality of the canonically married heterosexual as the absolute and exclusive ideal. And also, you think that an absolute declaration that every sexual partnership must conform to the pattern of commitment or else have the nature of sin and nothing else is unreal and silly. And you also say in this lecture that it's helpful to have more transient sexual encounters because this is going to help you find a faithful sexual relationship in the future, which statistically isn't true, actually, because the more sexual partners a person has prior to getting married or involved in a relationship that they're expecting to be long term, the more sexual partners a person has before that, then the less likely it is that the anticipated long-term relationship is going to survive. Marriages break down more often in people who've had a large number of sexual partners before they got married, so that isn't even true. What you're saying, it just isn't true. And also, I mean, you find in communities where people don't tend to have sex before marriage, that those marriages tend to survive and the rates of divorce are very low. So the thing that you're arguing, that it's actually helpful to have transient sexual encounters before having sex in faithful relationships, just isn't true. It's completely the opposite of what's true. So just to finish off, I also want to mention that you were on the editorial committee of a journal published by the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Sexuality, and this journal is called Theology and Sexuality. So you remained on the editorial committee of this journal after being appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. This was a very controversial issue for many people, particularly conservative evangelicals who'd looked into this. So in order to give an example of the kind of thing that you were endorsing by being on the editorial committee of this journal, Theology and Sexuality, I'm going to read the abstract from an article that was published in January 2002. That was the year that you were appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. So just before you were appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, this article was published, and it's by no means unusual in this journal. So this is what you were endorsing by being on the editorial committee of this journal, when you're so freaked out and have to be obsessively going around the country and to foreign countries and other Christian denominations and to my secular employer and secular universities, just in case I might be a lesbian. Just in case I might be a lesbian, you have to go to all these efforts to try and discredit and destroy me. And you're on the editorial committee of this journal, Theology and Sexuality. So here's the article. I'm going to show it on the camera in a minute, this abstract. But here's the title of the article: A Place for Porn in a Gay Spiritual Economy. And here's the abstract. Long begins this article by posing the question, what makes good gay porn? His reflections lead him to suggest that images of good sex, real sex, hot sex, point towards ideal forms of masculinity. Employing the Platonic linkage between the good, the true and the beautiful, he argues that such ideal images lead towards the divine, who constitutes the authority of the true ideal. In this frame, good porn is not merely an escape from the present imperfection of life, but a foretaste of eternal happiness in the face of its seeming impossibility. You're obviously... I don't even know what to say about that. You know, it's just the biggest issue in the universe that's ever existed, that I might be a lesbian. And yet you're on the editorial committee of a journal that's publishing stuff like this, when you're appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and you're giving talks saying that anyone who thinks that you should only have sex in a relationship, not even within marriage, anyone who thinks that you should only have sex within a relationship is being unreal and silly. And it's just a complete coincidence that you're trying to get your leg over and I refused you. Anyway, I'm going to show this article now to prove that it really exists. So there it is. And you were on the editorial committee when this article was published, and that's the same year that you were appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. And as I've said, I mean, other people have researched this more than me, and I've certainly got no intention of reading the whole article because you have to pay to read them. But that's the abstract anyway. So this is the kind of interest you have, let's say. You are absolutely obsessed with sex, you really are, because it's not just things like the talk that you gave at the Royal College of Medicine, where the subject matter was sexuality and sexual health. It's not just in that context that you're talking about sex. It's you bring it up in general talks that you're giving, in lectures that you're giving, relatively frequently, which is quite unusual for any public figure, for an academic or a church leader, to be making references to sex and jokes about sex in the talks that they're giving. It's very unusual and hardly to be expected that the Archbishop of Canterbury would be doing that. So you're very preoccupied by sex, and as I've demonstrated in relation to St John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, you read it into situations where it doesn't exist. Thinking about sex I think, is something you do more than most people. You're more preoccupied by it, and you're more driven towards it. I'm not saying that other people don't want sex or that they never think about it, but they're able to prioritise, let's put it that way, and sex and thinking about sex is very high up your list of priorities, to the extent I think you think you'd cease to exist without it. And of course it is intrinsically bound up with exercising power in your case, because you won't take no for an answer. You think because you've bought women in the past, literally, I mean financially, you've paid sex workers, you think because you've bought women in the past, then that means that all women are for sale, and you won't take no for an answer. So you need to be possessing and exercising control and exercising ownership and dominating. So that's your attitude, in my experience. I mean, in my personal experience, but also in what I've seen you say and write on this subject. And even when you're not specifically talking about this subject, you still bring it in and use innuendo in a lot of cases where it's not really appropriate, particularly for a public figure, and particularly for someone who's supposed to be a church leader. Anyway, I shall leave it there for now. I have seen the video actually of the little talk that you gave at St Paul's Cathedral, in the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral yesterday, at the launch of Eco Church. I'm very sorry I didn't get there to arrest you, but never mind. And it seems you were unable to bilocate because people couldn't find you in Cambridge. They wondered where you were when you were supposed to be giving a lecture there. So you'll have to practice bilocation, won't you, if you haven't quite mastered that yet. I thought it would be no trouble for you, you see, since you're in charge of the universe. I thought you'd be able to bilocate quite easily. Anyway, you did say some bizarre things in this lecture, and which is only a short talk that you gave, along with some other people as well. So I will be making some comments about that as well, but I'll leave it there for now. But basically, to summarise, you're absolutely obsessed with sex, and with more unusual expressions of sex and sexuality as well. You think it's ridiculous that anyone should believe that you should only have sex within relationships, faithful relationships. You think it's helpful for people to have a number of sexual experiences with other people, and this will help find a faithful relationship, even though research shows that the opposite is true. And you're quite happy being on the editorial committee of a journal that publishes things about porn in a gay spiritual economy, but for some mysterious reason it was just cataclysmic that I might be a lesbian according to you, just because I didn't fancy you. Anyway, I shall leave it there now, so I'll be making another video tomorrow. So, have a nice day. Hasta mañana.
Fiction helps you to understand that whatever the principles, whatever the sort of standing rules and perspectives on the moral and the spiritual life, human beings are every bit as unpredictable as Dostoevsky sets out, that they resist rational cataloguing and categorization, and they often resist reasonable solutions. And you don't begin to understand humanity unless you understand that thread of wildness that's in it all. And because I believe, as a Christian, that my faith obliges me to engage with every area of human life and human experience, fiction is a crucial part of nourishing my faith.
Archbishop Dr. Rowan Williams, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.